Hi, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. I'm here with Inez once again. And Inez, this last week, we've had two entries. I mean, we knew this was coming last time we talked, Pence and Christie. I think we've covered Pence and Christie, the last few shows. But now they're officially in the game. Is there anything sort of you thought that was noticeable about their announcements and their sort of rollouts?
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about the January 6th focus that Pence rolled out with. I said last time I'm completely not a fan of Pence. I think if you're going to fold on the central sort of issues like religious liberty that you're identified with, I just long thought of him as a politician without a spine. Um, that being said, if you have this, you're going into the Republican Party with this liability of having confronted and told Trump no during January 6th, I think it's a good idea to go straight through it because certainly the voters haven't forgotten about it. So, I mean, his ad was very much a throwback to Reaganism. I don't think that's particularly effective. That being said, I don't think anything from Mike Pence is going to be particularly effective, and at least he salvages some self-respect by doing it this way. I mean, I think it would be really cringy to watch him sort of scrape and bow again after that. So I'm glad he's not doing that, at least.
What did you think about when they asked him on CNN and he said basically he got him to say he hopes Trump is not indicted over the classified documents case, but then like they sort of pressed him, what if he broke the law? And he really didn't seem to have a good answer on that.
Yeah, I mean, there are two different issues here, and I don't know which one he was being interviewed over. One is the First Amendment question of whether Trump incited violence. It seems to me that Trump has a pretty ironclad case that he did not. Mike Pence called those comments ill-advised and sort of criticized them, but from the leadership perspective, not the legal one. And I think that's right. It's pretty clear that Trump added the whole peaceful thing at the end. Is pretty clear he wasn't inciting violence. If
Yeah,
he was
yeah.
inciting violence, we
There's no
have
First Amendment case. Yeah,
endless examples of politicians inciting violence from Bernie to I can never remember who it is that told people to go and get in Republicans' faces and even in like restaurants and stuff during the 2020 summer of Floyd, if you will. Barbara Lee, I think. Anyway, we have a congresswoman doing that. I mean, that case I don't think is going to hurt Trump at all. Um, the documents case in itself, I don't think it hurts Trump. The lying to the grand jury piece of the case is the only piece that I would be worried if I were Trump, because on the underlying charge he has a lot of answers, both political and legal. Right, on the underlying charge he can say legally, I had the power to declassify. I think there's a really strong case that you don't need to follow the bureaucratic procedure as president. This is another one of those cases where you're elevating sort of administrative state procedure over the people who actually hold constitutionally the power given to them by our political procedure and by elections, right? So I think he has a really strong underlying case that, but you also can't make false statements to a jury. And to the extent that they can prove that he did that, like false statements to a grand jury, that's a serious charge. It carries jail time. So to the extent that I think he has a problem there, it's that. He has a good political case against it, though. He just says, hey, like they found a bunch of documents in Joe Biden's backyard, too, right? Comparing it to the Hillary thing, right? She destroyed classified documents under subpoena, right? Like these are, I mean, he has a really strong case to do the Trump thing, which is point to how the rest of the system is so incredibly corrupt and they're just coming after him. But still, that one sticking point. If I were the Trump team, I would worry about that one sticking point about what was misrepresented potentially to the grand jury, because that, especially in a DC case, I feel like
yeah,
you're not in a good position if you did that.
yeah. I mean, from the details of what's been reported, it really seems like there was, the legal system, as sort of, frowns upon sort of, bad faith efforts, sort of not to comply with, what they're trying to do. And so there's, subpoenas that, they seem to have lied about, the document availability. They seem to have, there's a story that they had a dress rehearsal for how to move documents in case the feds showed up. I mean, it's really, really bad and really, really seemingly incriminating. And so, yeah, I mean, it's sort of it's hard for Pence is going to be in a difficult situation. So this could be. I mean, there was reports that this could happen by today. We're recording this July 8th. Maybe the subpoena will have come down by the time people listen to this, or not. It's probably coming soon. I mean, I don't think there's many people who think there won't be. there won't be a charge in this case. Is this going to be the New York charge all over again, or do you think this is this is something different?
If I were the feds in this case, I'd be really mad at Alvin Bragg for sort of firing the weakest case first and making this an also, oh, and again Trump is being indicted, right, by his
Yeah.
political enemies. I don't know. I still think Trump's underlying case on this is really strong about whether or not he had the power to declassify documents, to take documents. I think this is a very open question. And certainly, again, he has that classically Trumpian case where he's like, yeah, they're coming after me, but they
Yeah.
all do this same
It
stuff.
would be selective in that case. If they just
Yeah,
charged him and then all these other people, that would be selective. I think it's going to focus on his behavior, the cover up, right?
right. And but even there, politically, I don't think he has a problem. Legally, he might have a problem, but politically, I don't think he has a problem. Anyone who has a problem with this already doesn't like Trump, right? The question is how much the legal system uh, can actually inhibit him from running for president, which itself is something I'm not. Still, there's a part of me that's shocked that we're discussing this. Like, this is why we don't indict former presidents, especially on ticky-tack charges like this, right? Like, lying to a grand jury is not a ticky-tack charge. However, the underlying stuff is ticky-tack, is very clearly politically selective, right? And so, in some sense, it reminds me of the Mike Flynn case, right? Where if they weren't going after him, they wouldn't have this underlying this finally this piece that they might actually be able to get him on if they weren't coming after him politically to begin with. I mean, this is why we don't play this game. We accept that there might be some like Rod Blagojevich level behavior that goes on with former presidents, all whatever 5 or 6 of them that are still alive, right? We kind of accept that possibility because it's so dangerous to start playing this game about whether or not you're going to lock up the Republican presumptive nominee of the Republican Party on something that is clearly politically motivated. I mean, that this is it is overused, but it is banana republic stuff. And so, I mean, I think Trump has a really good political case against it. The question is, and again, I can't believe we're having this conversation, but it's how much the legal system can prevent him from running for president. And that might not be
It
a
can't
small
though.
issue.
It can't though, right? I mean, what can it do? It can
Well,
put him in
so
jail.
I'm saying they can
You
tie up
can't
his
keep him.
time, right? He can't refuse to
That's
show
true.
up. They
Yeah.
can schedule hearings, right? They can keep him basically in court and tied up answering a lot of the the sort of charges and requests from a courtroom when he should be running for president. That's also with regard to money, right? It's going to be expensive to fight this stuff. So, I mean, they really can tie him up for a long time where he should be going around having rallies and talking about snakes and scorpions or whatever it is that
Yeah.
but like they can tie him up for a long time with these cases. And if he ignores them, they can get worse for him, right? So I don't know. And then there's the final question that if unless this the charge is very narrowly on the line to the grand jury charge. So if I were putting myself in their positions, that's what I would do. I would very narrowly try to prosecute this one charge where they have the strongest case against him. They probably won't do that because again, it is political and they want to sweep in as much stuff that they don't like about Trump as possible. But if there's a lot of those charges, it very well may not get to a courtroom before the election's over. So that really makes it do or die for Trump, right? Again, this is why we don't play this game with domestic opposition, is because if he gets elected, the case goes away. If he loses, he goes to jail. I mean, that's not the kind of incentives you want for people, going in and out of power. It's not the incentive that you want to be able to keep a peaceful transition of power. It's very dangerous stuff.
That's true. But the flip side of that is if you if you say basically we don't indict former presidents or we don't indict people who are frontrunners or serious candidates for president, I mean, does that mean that people can just sort of break the law with impunity? Because that's also a worry too, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it is a worry. I would argue that it's a much lesser worry than the alternative. And I'm very upfront about this. There's a lot of people I think on the right who just don't accept this reality. And so my basic rule is the Omar rule, right? If you come at the king, you best not miss, right? If you are going to indict a former president who may be the domestic political opponent the next year, right? You better
Yeah.
have ironclad evidence of extremely serious crimes. It better be on the level of everyone saw Trump shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, right? To come after a former president on this kind of low level, most of this stuff is sort of low. What is it? Failing to report the bribe that he gave to a former, you know, hookup, failing to report that correctly on his taxes, right? You know, basically lock up the entirety of our politician class on that one. You know, keeping documents signed by Kim Jong-un or whatever, right? After, which clearly every other president has done and vice president has done in recent history, because we're finding those documents, and we have a very clear parallel in Hillary, a worse parallel that did not get prosecuted, right? I mean, it's a very clear First Amendment case on the incitement stuff in January 6th, right? Like, they're not apolitical, they're not ironclad, they don't have, you know, they depend on a lot of interpretation. They're novel legal theories, like the one in New York is, you know, basically trying to scratch my dad's expression. I've never heard anyone in America use this expression, but it fits here, which is you know, trying to scratch your left ear with your right hand. Like, the legal theory is convoluted and novel. So this is not, you know, come at the king, don't miss kind of stuff. It's a scattershot. What's the other metaphor I'm reaching for would be, it's like a buckshot. It's like coming at the king with buckshot, and you're hoping that one of the pellets is going to smack him right between the eyes. That is really, really dangerous stuff. You're playing with the sense of a huge part of the American people, millions and millions of people, that the political system is, and the legal system, more importantly, is completely politicized, and we're the kind of regime that locks up the opposition.
Yeah, the Alvin Bragg one. I mean, I think that this is the same DA who just charged Daniel Penny, which is also outrageous. The this
After
I
failing
remember.
to get a grand jury indictment, by the way, which is
Yeah,
pretty unusual, which you usually don't see.
that's
You
amazing.
see the, like, ham
That's
sandwich
amazing.
stuff. He could
That's
not get a
amazing.
grand jury indictment. He went for it anyway.
Yeah, that's amazing. The and then the I mean, I was listening to like the New Yorker podcast, like right when it happened. Even they were saying, well, this is sort of an iffy case. This is a stretch. I mean, a lot of people, a lot of legal analysts just really aren't buying this. So you're absolutely right. And then this one, I don't know. There doesn't appear to be, there's no reporting that there's going to be an incitement to violence. There doesn't seem there's going to be anything on January 6th, getting people to storm the Capitol. That doesn't seem like it's going to happen. But the documents case, there seems like something legitimate there. I don't, I don't. Yeah, I mean, as far as tying him up for running for president, so he was, they told him that the trial in New York is going to start in March, so it's around the time of Super Tuesday, and apparently Trump's reaction in court was unhappy to that. So this is around like Super Tuesday. Um, it's going to tie him up, but it's unless this stuff really. I'm trying to imagine. I'm trying to imagine like if it's just like the first indictment, it's just it's just good for him, right? He shoots up in the polls after that, right? He's in a court. He's in court. There's maybe cameras in the court, maybe not. Trump is still the focus. No one else is going to get attention. I mean, are Republican voters going to abandon him at that point? It's hard to imagine. So you're right. Theoretically, they could like tie someone up and prevent him from running. In this case, Trump like doesn't even want to be at the debates, right? Like, what if he can't go to the debates because he's got some legal? Well, that's probably too soon. But you see what I'm saying? Like, for him, he could just he just wants to sort of coast to the nomination, and this just might make it more likely.
Possible. I mean, I think I was also thinking about the general election. Like, most of these cases will continue into the general election. And there, I think it
Yeah,
is very possible that tying up Trump and not uh, giving him money and time to fly around the country and campaign could be important. Maybe not. Maybe not in the digital age. Maybe it doesn't matter anymore. But to the extent that it still matters very much to be able to go and press flesh with voters and stuff all around the country. I mean, that could keep him from doing it. He's got all of these now. There are 4 cases now. There might be a federal indictment on top. Like, it's a lot of legal stuff. I don't think it really hurts him all that much. I think the people who are politically, the people who are horrified by this are not going to be Trump voters, anyway. I mean, I guess you could make the case that it might energize the opposition, but I think Trump does that so much anyway that just having his name on the ballot has the same effect. Um, I don't know. I don't know how much any of this hurts. To the extent that it matters in the primaries, I think it's less. I tend to think like that shoot up in the polls effect, and we'll see shortly. probably has its limits in the sense that if it's the fourth indictment, I don't think that people react the same way as when it's the first one. But it does keep Trump constantly in the news, and it ensures that DeSantis and everybody else are going to be constantly asked questions. Well, what do you think about Trump's legal case? And it's just Trump will remain the center of the universe, the political universe in which he revolves, and to that extent that it denies his opponents the ability to actually talk about anything other than Trump in the news cycle. I think that does help Trump.
Yeah, and there's sort of seems to be sort of a conventional wisdom that maybe it hurts him in the general, but doesn't hurt him in the primaries. I looked at polling right before and right after the Bragg indictment, and he didn't slip at all. He's even might have gained a point on Biden. So I think this makes him look like makes him look like the underdog, makes it seem like he's being picked on. I think it probably on balance, if he's got legal problems going into the election, it might help. That's my intuition. I'm not sure about that, but it's to be far from obvious that it actually hurts him.
Yeah, I mean,
And
look,
so
this is all novel stuff. But we've never had a president running under indictment. So, I mean,
yeah,
as
well,
far as I know, as far as I can recall in American history, we've never had a president running under indictment. Um,
yeah,
so you could easily be right. I just my worry is they actually might convict him on this one charge. They might convict him, and there's jail time involved. So one imagines that he can do something crazy. This is a federal charge. He could pardon himself, right? If he wins the
yeah,
election. If he doesn't win the election, he can't do that. He maybe goes to jail, and I don't know. Those are not incentives that
yeah.
are conducive to a normal exchange of power. Um, and I don't know what happens, but it scares me.
Yeah, the state case, he can't be pardoned there, and it theoretically has, I think, like a year or 2 year maximum. So theoretically, it doesn't seem like something you'd probably go to jail for. Who knows? New York jury probably don't like Trump. Who knows what'll happen. You're right. It is. I mean, it is fascinating. I mean, we are looking toward like the scenario where Trump will probably, I mean, the most likely nominee, and he will have court cases, and there will be jail time potentially at the end of them, and and like what's gonna happen? I mean, like is like the Georgia case, right? So you have the New York case, you got the Georgia case. There will be trials. There will be trials that will have to be scheduled. They're going to run into the election, right? I don't think he's probably going to delay it, so they'll probably. And then what happens? No precedent. Do they cancel the trial? So I see you in 4 years.
Can a
So you have to.
state can a state extend jurisdiction over the president of the United States? I have no idea. I I think most
Well,
of the state
they do
cases
have.
they can
I mean, they do have
resolve.
jurisdiction. You're still I mean, you're still a person who committed a crime. You don't get magic powers if you're
I mean,
president
the
to
president has a
like.
lot of magic powers with regard to that, though. But it hasn't normally been applied vis-a-vis the states, and maybe there's some precedent to this that I'm not aware of. But I mean, the president has plenty of shielding power. He has executive privilege. There's enormous shielding power that the president has with regard to court
Yeah,
cases now. But all those court cases that I'm aware of have always been federal, and I mean, I have no idea what happens in that case, but I actually don't think on a lot of these state charges, either if there is a conviction on the state, there's a lot of grounds you can appeal on, because again, the underlying legal stuff is not that scary. These four cases are not that scary for Trump. The only thing that is, I think, in my view, is scary for him is this misrepresenting to the grand jury, and that is a federal crime. And
yeah.
that's probably, if he's going to be indicted by the feds, that's probably going to be that. And that case may or may not be adjudicated by the election. It might be adjudicated after the election.
Yeah, you refer to four cases. I see three. I see the New York, the documents, the Georgia case. Are you including what do you where do you see four?
So New York, Georgia, he had the civil case, which is also in New York, I guess. Um, and then, shoot, what's the there's the there is the documents, and then the January 6th. Those are two separate things. The indictment, or sorry, incitement to violence, and the documents request act, or whatever, like records request act.
Is Jack Smith also investigating the January 6th stuff? Is that the same prosecutor?
No, I don't know. That's a good question. Um,
Yeah.
they haven't been able to. And then on top of all these indictments, by the way, we might have two people running. I mean, probably not, because one of them controls the FBI. But I mean, there's quite a few developments in the corruption case with Biden, and there's apparently, that's moving forward. That Christopher Wray is on his way to be held in contempt of Congress for failing to produce, or he did produce this document, but it was heavily redacted, and members of Congress weren't allowed to take notes on it, or keep it in their possession, right? But apparently what was in there, and some of this might be a media game, and you never know, but apparently some of what's in there has confirmed what they believe is happening, with this apparently $5 million bribe to Joe Biden. This is directly to Joe Biden. This is not Hunter. This is not like the rest of his family. This is Joe Biden. I mean, so theoretically, we have two people under investigation. We have two people, the nominees of each major party, under investigation.
In this one we have Republican congressmen saying there's a whistleblower, but they can't. Last I checked, they couldn't find him. What's the status of this thing?
Well, so the FBI is saying they have to protect the informer, right? So, and that's why they're not releasing a lot of this information. And there was these battles between the committee subpoenaing this information and subpoenaing Chris Wray to talk about it, is my understanding. And he's not appeared to talk about it. They have given them some version of this document heavily redacted. They're not satisfied with that, right? So, I mean, to some extent, it's hard to say what they're going to do. The worst thing the House can do is bring impeachment charges. The Senate obviously not going to pick that up. So I think the FBI feels very emboldened to refuse the subpoena. But who knows? If the composition of the Senate changes, that changes.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, and the way I feel about congressional Republicans is it does. It seems like this is, we don't have, we have claims. We don't. I mean, we don't have any corroboration. Not even like a real investigation. It's just that one guy saying stuff, right? Is there even allegations that he has like proof of something?
No. So it's the guy who's saying it is a informant, and somebody that has worked with the FBI for a long time, and whose information has been judged credible in the past. Right, so you already have more than you had with the dossier, with the investigation. I mean,
seems worth
of
an
Trump.
investigation.
So I think one of the real elements of this, aside from what's true about these underlying charges, is going to be, especially when you have the Durham report out, laying this out side by side, saying how the FBI has treated information from credible informants, right? How they've treated it differently every step of the process when it was about Trump and when it's about Joe Biden, right? So I think that's probably a stronger case than anything else. But in terms of politics, it doesn't really matter. I tend to think a lot of this corruption stuff, it's almost that people just assume that everybody in power is corrupt now, which is why it doesn't hurt Trump and why it may not hurt Biden.
Yeah. I think that's right. Yeah, it used to be you could have we're beyond corruption scandals, right? I think you could see like Christie, who we might want to talk about, came out and said, Jared and Ivanka left office and they got, they after the Trump administration, they got $2 billion from the Saudis. Yeah, there seems to be some weird stuff going on with Jared and the Gulf Arab monarchies, and nobody cares. I mean, nobody cares, and nobody cares about Hunter either, except for Republicans. I mean, I don't think Democrats, I don't think even swing voters at this point. It just seems like a wash to people, right? I don't think it. Yeah, the 2016, it seemed like the Clinton Foundation stuff did. It seems like it did sort of hit. I guess there was like a thing where it's like Trump sort of people expected, and then like Clinton maybe they did it. You could still sort of get Hillary on being corrupt, but it seems like by now. I think there's been like after the Hillary thing, and now with all the stuff with Hunter, which people they might not have an opinion on, but they sort of just hear, that something's fishy is going on. Yeah, I don't think anyone expects any politician to be clean at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's bad news and goes towards the general mistrust of institutions, and you can see this in the polling on the FBI and the DOJ, right? It plummets on the Republican side. Democrats slightly up. They trust the FBI and the DOJ more, which is obviously partisan, but you still have an overall very, very low trust in these law enforcement agencies. That's bad for the country. I mean, I know that it sounds Pollyannish at this point to say that, but indicting former presidents is bad for the country. The fact that millions and millions of Americans on both sides of the political aisle do not trust the FBI and the DOJ to, sort of adjudicate some of these cases fairly, to bring these cases and investigate them in a fair way. That's really bad. That being said, I think there are good reasons to believe all this stuff. So I'm not saying that one has to be crazy not to trust these institutions. In fact, it's worse because you don't have to be crazy. You just have to see how they've behaved, particularly in the last 5 years. But none of this is quote unquote good for the country. I think it goes to the extremely serious, the fact that Americans are just shrugging at the fact that these two people who are probably going to win the nomination are probably corrupt. That's not a good thing. And even if you went back 15 years, I mean, any one of these things would be an enormous deal, and everybody would be like up in arms about it. And any one of these stories, of which there's been 6, 7, 8 at this point about the Bidens and Trump, any one of those stories could destroy a political career 10 to 15 years ago. And it just doesn't seem to be the case now because everybody is rightfully cynical about it. They're like, they're all doing
Yeah, yeah, I remember. Sometimes you hear stories about like, Harry Truman like wouldn't sell like he like didn't have that much money after he retired, and they wanted him to sell, I don't know, some product like toothpaste or something, and he like wouldn't do it because it was beneath his dignity. Ulysses S. Grant, I heard that basically, his one of the reasons why he wrote his memoirs, which ended up being very highly regarded, was he actually needed the money. Like, he just didn't have a lot of money after being president. I sort of blame Bob Dole. Um, you're probably not old enough to remember this, but in the late 1990s, Bob Dole, like, he runs for president and loses in 1996, and then he endorses Viagra. And it was funny because Viagra was new. And like they got Bob Dole as their, talking, being on TV, like, oh, I have Viagra now. Like, yeah, I'm doing much better. And like, it was like really fun. It was like the best marketing campaign for Viagra ever because they like, it's just like, it's like a boner pill. People like weren't used to it. So it's just like funny in and of itself. But then like the Bob Dole commercials, it was just like, late night like talk shows, like, haha, here's Bob Dole and his Viagra. And like he had this life of being like World War II hero and like senator and like presidential candidate. It just ends it with, I'm selling Viagra pills. I don't have anything against anyone taking Viagra. But it was something different. And I
It's
wonder
funny
if,
here. I'm
if that
thinking
led
about
us here.
Gorbachev. Gorbachev also was in that Pizza
Yeah,
Hut
yeah.
commercial, right? Which
Yes.
I interpret
Yes.
now as sort of the American equivalent of dragging the king of the Gauls in a cage for a triumph, right? Like you humiliate your enemies by making them do a Pizza Hut commercial when they once ran, the second greatest global power, right? Um, but apparently we do it to our own too. So I don't know what that says about the American empire.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem like I can't think of examples of this from the '80s, but yeah, just Bob Dole might not have been the first. It's just like my lifetime, like the first one I really remember. And then after that, you can endorse anyone can endorse anything. I saw something of George W. Bush a few years ago. He was going to like there was like some like thing where it was like some kind of like motivational speaker, just like this lame, very gaudy like guy who just gives motivational speeches. It has like this big like conference, and it was like Kobe Bryant. Kobe Bryant was still alive, and like I don't know, some singer or something, and then like George W. Bush, and Bush is just like sitting in the picture with like Kobe Bryant and like the singer, and it's just like like what is this? This is not. If I was the president, like that's not what I would do in my retirement. I'd make money, maybe I'd be on a board or something, maybe. But I don't know if I'd give speeches at like self-help conferences. That does not seem to be like something they should be doing.
I mean, there's a larger question here about whether any legitimate authority can be sort of claimed in a mass democracy, particularly with social media, right? Whether the necessity of the veil over authority to some extent, the necessity that we believe that our leaders are not, not endorsing Viagra and not like hawking stuff or, you know, um, I mean, I think there's something to be said for that. I used to think about the press under JFK just not reporting on his, all his affairs and his shady dealings and everything else. And I used to think that was a dereliction of duty on the part of the media. I think now we almost have the opposite problem where we have a 24/7 news cycle. We know too much about these people, although, of course, the press has a very strong political perspective and they do run interference for politicians that they like. Nevertheless, it's kind of hard to avoid these kinds of videos, right? we've all seen the president fall now. That used to be a huge deal, and now it's not, apparently. There's a certain amount of just the respect that one needs to believe that the people in charge of the country know what they're doing, which may have never been true, has certainly not been true for the last 30 years. Um, but it's another thing to know that abstractly and to see it just in the open view. I think this is very degenerative of the respect that's necessary to actually have the kind of authority and legitimacy that people will accept. For example, lawmaking or other exercises of hierarchy and authority. There's something very interesting about living in a mass democracy when you know everything about the leadership.
What do you think? You brought up JFK. What do you think in retrospect of the Clinton impeachment? There was technically over perjury, but actually it all started because of sex, and that's what they were interested in. Would you think that was sort of that was sort of like that was something that just was different and some kind of norm was broken there?
Look, I was too young to really follow that when it happened. Although
Of course, but
I will say
you have a historical
one of my
sense.
first political memories was listening to the president on the radio saying, that he did not have sex with that woman or sexual intercourse with her. I think it was his technical way of getting around it. But I just believed him because you believe the president, and the president doesn't lie. I do think that obviously I was like a naive child, but I do think that for a lot of people, that was the beginning of this kind of dam breaking, where it's not like Bill Clinton did anything that previous presidents, at least some of them, did. I mean, in the particulars, maybe, but cigars and everything else. But it's not like previous presidents hadn't had affairs while in office and so on. But it is the first example of what I was referencing just a minute ago about this sort of mass democracy and mass media coming together to tell us everything about our leadership. So I think people were rightly shocked. I think we probably live to regret making such a big deal out of it and creating this entire special counsel system. And since then, there's the political temptation. Once there's a political tool out there for use, you basically can't put it back in the bottle. Like, I think impeachment's going to become much more common now, now that it's been used so blatantly politically, and you can argue that started in the 90s. But the same thing with Supreme Court confirmations, right? Bork was the first very political confirmation, and since then, basically every confirmation battle, and they're getting uglier and uglier over time as well. But basically every confirmation battle of consequence that changes anything about the composition of the court is going to be a very aggressive and ugly political battle. There's no way, once you have that kind of weapon out there, it's used by one side, it's going to be used by the other. Same thing with like the filibuster rules in the Senate and so on. It's just something to think about every time. But at this point, I'm sort of, again, this all feels very old fashioned to even talk about. Like I said, I feel like we know that all of our leaders are corrupt and that they're all making money. I don't know if you've seen the Unusual Whales report every year. He just compiles how much better members of Congress did than the whatever the baseline. I don't know anything about stocks, but the baseline of how the market did. And of course, members of Congress, somehow they're all amazing stock traders, and they almost all do well above the baseline, right?
So I haven't looked too much into this, but from I saw somebody actually say that this was that the guy was cherry picking. That actually, if you look at different congressmen, that like he's just taking the ones who had like the best performances in the reporting. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's actually an interesting.
Well, he has an
Interesting
average.
question.
Like, he takes all of them, and the average is above. So there are members of Congress who perform below, but consistently the average of all of them, like he just does all members of Congress versus and it's consistently above.
Okay. Okay. Well, that makes sense. Okay. Well, that's interesting. I'll post the links to that. Yeah. This the
Or at least
norms.
I think.
The norms.
I don't understand stocks, so take that with
Well, there's a baseline, but yeah. Okay. Well, we'll put the link in it. People who know this stuff can look into it for themselves. Um, yeah. The norms thing is very interesting, and these debates are sort of it's like angels dancing on the head of a pin. It's like the courts, I'm sure you follow closely. It's like everyone goes a little like one step further than Then the last one, then people will say, "Oh, the last thing you did was the broken the norm." So it was under the Bush administration, George W. Bush. The Republicans really started playing hardball with the court nominees, and so they broke they broke some norm there. And then Republicans were the first ones to I think it was get rid of the filibuster for Supreme Court. So they're like, "Oh no, you took it to the Supreme Court. That is a much bigger right." And so it's all very stupid. And then the Merrick Garland thing, it was like it was like almost McConnell almost like didn't even pretend like the justifications like, well, we're going to have another election. Like, yeah, we'll always have another election. I was actually interested to see what would happen if Republicans had the Senate and then Hillary won. Like, I don't think there was any principle that said they couldn't hold on to it for 4 years. But like, if you're going to have a judicial dictatorship, basically, if you're going to have a judgeocracy where judges come along and basically they can just say whatever law you passed, we now say it's unconstitutional, and like they can just basically do whatever they want. I think it's like legitimate. I don't think I think there are basically you can basically do what you want. I think anything is fair basically when it comes to courts. Although we do have to have some norms somewhere. I'm not a complete nihilist on this stuff. What do you think?
I mean, I think some norms are really important. I agree with you that it was a tit for tat thing going back and forth. I do think that the Bork confirmation was the first to break from what had been a standard of just
Yeah,
confirming judges. But again, to what you just said, and I agree with it, the court started acting as a super legislature
yeah,
in the 60s and 70s. So it makes perfect sense that we would politicize the confirmation of judges. It's one of the most important political, you know, political whatever like expressions of elections that now that's why Trump had to put out that list and why the nominations have become so important. I mean, it is because the court itself has stepped so aggressively into politics and I would say has carved out way too many issues from the democratic process, especially starting in the 70s. So, yeah, I mean, it makes sense that it's going to be. Now, I still think that, for example, a good norm would be not to bring in families and to bring in what in many cases are obviously charges of sexual assault that fall far, far below the standard of credibility. Like that's a particularly ugly way of dealing with it, and an enraging way of dealing with it. But yeah, I mean, it is going to be political, and the same thing about withholding, approval of Garland's nomination. I mean, what's the difference actually between just refusing to hold the confirmation hearings and just holding the confirmation hearings and voting on it? That Senate was never going to confirm Merrick Garland. I
no,
don't.
I think the fear was that they would. It was like close to 50-50, and there was a fear that a few Republicans would like switch over, and they actually would.
I don't know. In any case, it's an exercise of political power that's completely
Yeah, of
legitimate, right?
course.
This is a political
Mhm.
process for a reason. This is the political gauntlet that Supreme Court justices have to run in order to be sat for life and allegedly sat beyond politics. I think that's something very different, by the way, than what's happening currently with the increasing push from the left to delegitimize the court as a whole and to delegitimize, for example, enforcement. You have AOC out there, which AOC says a lot of things, but um, very openly saying that the executive branch should refuse to enforce court decisions. Now, each branch has its constitutional duties in that regard, but uh, that really will completely break down uh, any norms we have about the judiciary in this country. I mean, I think that's extremely dangerous. That seems to be the theme, right? We have talked about multiple times, like whether we think the state of the country is bad or not. This is why I think the state of the country is bad. You can't point to any of these norms and procedures and institutions in important ways, not in the ways that like the democracy dies in darkness, Washington Post, like sort of hysteria about things that Trump did or said. Um, but in this deeper way where you have a real breakdown of the norms that are incredibly important to perpetuating a peaceful, for example, peaceful democratic transfer of power in the case of indictments of former presidents. You have incredible, attacks on the independence of the judiciary, right? There was that New York Times piece just published, op-ed published by a law professor saying that the court should essentially that a Democratic Congress should defund the Supreme Court, right? This is published in the New York Times and taken seriously, right? That actually, oh, I'll give you another one. The norm that under Trump we had generals communicating with China without ever bringing those kinds of communications through the elected president. That's a pretty big one. Civilian control over the military. That's generally one of those big small R Republican norms. For the people who are always banging on about norms, I mean, those kinds of norms that they are so up in the air and in many cases easily broken, I think is an indication that the country is in very serious trouble and not just sort of surface level trouble where we're yelling at each other.
Yeah, I mean, we should have a longer conversation about just Trump and norms and sort of what happened there. And yeah, we might have a different view in January 6th and all that. But yeah, we could table that. We could table that for now. Let's get to sort of today's June and we're in June, and so it's Pride Month, and a lot of exciting things have been happening in Pride Month. I mean, I saw your tweet in which the logos are not they're not putting rainbow logos up. There was a an analysis by a guy named Noah Carl who argues that the Target and the Bud Light boycotts are basically, there's more of a statistical sort of signal that they're having a big impact, much more than the other stuff, like Disney and these other things and these historical trends. There was just a couple videos of the last like day or two of Armenians in Glendale and then Muslims in Montgomery County. Montgomery County is that Virginia or Maryland?
I think that's Maryland. Yeah, it's
I think
Maryland.
it was Maryland, yeah. And so there was that, and so there seems to be something going on here. I mean, has it just like the LGBT stuff? I mean, has it just like pushed too far? I mean, is that all that's happening here? And sort of Pride Month is sort of the shelling point for people who are fed up to push back.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that it's not just about the tea, right? There seems to be more of a general pushback, and that doesn't mean that people, have changed their minds, for example, on an issue like gay marriage, but just the sense that enough is enough. We're tired of seeing this 24/7. It's kind of the live version of that meme with the tuba, and like over the face of the girl, and it's written on the tuba is like LGBT propaganda, and like people are just sick of the 24/7 celebration. And I think to the extent that the Pride celebration has pushed further and further, even aside from the tea, like for example, just plain old drag queens, not people who claim to be as a matter of truth, right, the opposite sex, but like plain old drag queens. We had the Dodgers incident with the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence or whatever they're called, who apparently are a long running activist group that actually interrupts Catholic services and does things like that. But I think there's a general, or even some of the images of Pride parade stuff of like, guys in leather and like dog ears or whatever, where there are children present. I do think there's a uh, certain push tipping point where people are just fed up with this kind of deviancy in the public square. There was sort of a tolerance, and the deal with gay marriage was, oh, we're going to we're going to let the gays into these bourgeois norms, right? They're going to get a nice white picket fence, and a lot of people did. And I think Americans still probably have very little problem with that. But it was a bit like our '90s view towards China, where we thought that that system would sort of reflect the American system and the end of history and the triumph of liberal democracy, right, in the '90s. And instead, what happened is elements of their system really fed back into ours. And I think that's kind of what happened with a lot of this Pride Month stuff, where people thought, oh, like we extend gay marriage and equality in a certain sense, in this sense, this is going to feed back into bourgeois norms, and actually they're going to join us on this with our white picket fence, and we're going to grill for Fourth of July. And that was kind of the deal. That's the Andrew Sullivan deal that was presented to America. And what they got instead was this ever escalating sort of obvious deviant behavior in public in Pride events, and then endorsed by major corporations. And I do think that people have kind of reached a tipping point with that. All of that being said, there are backlashes all the time, and there are institutional forces at play. And I'd be very curious to see if this actually is converted into real policy or real change in any way. If it's just that the companies are a little quieter about this for a few years while the backlash dies down, it won't ultimately be very effective. But if there are real changes made on behalf of this in a more lasting way, it may be.
Yeah, I mean, California, I mean, is really, I mean, there it doesn't seem like any backlash is going to affect it. I mean, this seems to be the number one, Pride Month and assorted activity seems to be the number one priority of the state government. the just last like over one day, like the office of the governor of California was tweeting out like it was threatening some local school board in Riverside because they have these LGBTQ requirements for social studies, and some local like school didn't want to implement them, and like the governor's like threatening them, and then the governor is also threatening Orange County. They didn't want to put up the pride flag during Pride. So like they're like, I guess there's no state law on this, but they're just like telling them like, they just denounce like the local government. They denounce, of course, the Armenians in Glendale. I mean, there's something very bizarre. I mean, there's just some like kind of fanaticism on this issue. I got to show you. There's this. Did you see that video of that one state legislator, that woman, red-haired woman in Nebraska, who just like is screaming like "trans kids exist" or something like
Yep,
that? She goes,
just having
"Trans
a
kids exist."
hysterical breakdown. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a long New Yorker profile of this woman, and like the people around her, and she was doing this for months and months. She was holding up the entire, Nebraska as the only unicameral legislature in the country. So she was like about they were trying to stop gender affirming, so-called gender affirming care for kids, and she just held up like the entire business of the state house over this. And it's really, I mean, it's just, you see this sort of like fanaticism of these like, mostly white women, I think, like, who are like either teachers or like politicians who are in these like, or in these like professional, settings. You don't see like a lot of cis hetero men like, crying about trans kids dying. It's just not that common. um I don't, I'm a little bit, I'm confused like how we got to this point. Like, do you do you have a sense of like who these people are and like where they came from and how this became like their number one priority?
I mean, I have two separate answers on that. One is more general and applies to both sexes, and one's on specifically with regard to women. The one on specifically with regard to women is I think it's misapplied, um, sort of misapplied family and maternal instincts. And I think you see that on issues like immigration too, right? Where generally, and this is not a critique necessarily of women, although it might be a critique of how much power they have in terms of the public square. But uh, it's not a critique of women to say that women are more that their hearts are more easily moved by whatever like plight uh, of the less fortunate around them. I don't think that that's a bad thing. It can be very, very important within a family, for example, or very important within a community. So before all the women sort of entered the public square and went off to work, if you look at any small town, and this is actually relevant to something that you tweeted, Richard, but um, there were basically two things that women did for the public square and for the town that were incredibly important that have atrophied. Both of them have atrophied enormously since women went and sort of participated in the larger public square and in politics. One is basically every statue that you've ever seen, and a lot of the ones that are coming down, of course, in 2020. But any sort of public monument in small towns, almost always put up by a women's organization. If you look at those plaques on the side, it almost always say, the daughters of this town, or daughters of, Civil War veterans, or it's usually a local women's civic organization that does a lot of that stuff. And to the extent that we've lost those kinds of civic organizations because there's only so many hours in a day, and now women are getting paid for their labor, that's disappeared. And the other thing is, of course, that very bright women who are now in law firms or in business or in corporate America used to be teachers. And the quality of teaching has suffered enormously as those women have gotten more options and therefore have gone off to make a bunch of money, just like the men have. And the quality of teaching has suffered enormously because of that. I think there's a few academic papers that basically trace this, but of course they're very they're cancelable, and people try to pretend that they don't exist. But these are, even if you're in favor of women sort of going off to work and entering the public square, you have to acknowledge that these are trade-offs. These are things that were done for communities and for future generations, and they're public things, and they're things that either don't exist anymore at all, or they exist in a much lower quality way because the people who invest in them have not been of the quality of the people who left, the women who left behind those roles. But in a larger sense, there's an argument to be made about like the crisis of meaning in the West and the falling away from religion. And I say this as somebody who's an atheist, right? I think it's pretty clear now that a lot of these causes do feel something about identity and about righteousness and having a purpose in life that has just we have not been able to replace that feeling that people once sought in religion. I think it's this is not a new comparison, but it I don't think it's a bad framework to think of wokeism as America's fifth great awakening.
Yeah, yeah, that all makes sense. As far as women and yeah, their how they sort of relate to politics. I guess I'm wondering, yeah, I get the maternal instinct, misplaced maternal instinct, and all that. Why the trans? Like, how did we get to like choose your gender? I mean, there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of things. There's the BLM stuff. Um, there's other things, but this in particular, like for like public school teachers and like the liberal white woman, it's just gay and trans seems to like really dominate their mind in a way that like nothing else does, right? And what was it about this issue in particular that it sort of sucked up that instinct?
No, I think there have been other issues. I think the reason that we're here, and this is one of the things that I argue with a lot of my allies about, because I have worked with a lot of TERFs, because I work on issues of the definition of sex under law and women's sports and all of that. I've worked with a lot of TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, and I like a lot of them, and they certainly take a lot of slings and arrows in a way that actually conservatives really don't, because we don't have I think of myself, for example, as sort of pre-canceled, right? My networks, my social networks and my professional networks don't depend on the left in the same ways. And therefore, like saying controversial things about men and women, for example, doesn't require as much courage from me as it does from them, because the consequences aren't there. But I do think this is all of a piece. This didn't start a few years ago. And I think the trans thing, for example, is perfectly compatible both with all the waves of feminism, but also with Justice Kennedy's words in Casey, right? At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, meaning in the universe, and the mystery of human life, or whatever. I'm paraphrasing here, but it turns out that carving yourself out of whole cloth is a very ongoing and I think immiserating process, and with no signposts, so you don't define yourself. I think the three major bases that human beings have answered this question, and this is from Mary Eberstadt's work, but it's that question, who am I, has been nation or tribe, right? It expanded to the nation, maybe not. Has been family and has been religion, right? So who am I? I'm a child of God, or I'm a member of this religion. Who am I? I'm a daughter. I'm a wife. I'm a mother, right? Who am I? I'm a member of tribe X, right? I'm a Jew or I'm an American, and those are two very different identities, right? With different sort of cachet in each one, but all of those things have are on the downslope. All of the like we don't have intact families increasingly, so we don't have that kind of example. We don't define ourselves as part of our families necessarily anymore. It is much more atomized. Um, we certainly have the decline of religion. And then even now, we see like nation states, the existence of nation states, while it's coming, there's a backlash where it's roaring back. There is this temptation to discover in a digital age and mass communication that, in fact, elites have more in common with each other across national boundaries than they might have in common with their fellow countrymen within national boundaries. And layer on top of that, since the 1960s, the left has been saying it's jingoistic and borderline, sort of xenophobic or whatever else to actually take pride in your country. It's dangerous. It makes you like Hitler, right? So, I mean, there's not a lot of those natural bases left. So it doesn't surprise me that people are so attached to their identities in this way. This is what makes them special. It makes them you, right? And so that's why people react like you're attacking. If you say men can't become women, it's like, no, you're attacking who I am, right? As opposed to adjudicating a question.
Yeah, but those seems like there's a few different things there. So when you say it's sort of like they're defining, the people are just defining themselves. It seems like the propaganda from the sort of the trans activism is sort of the opposite. It's like a very hard, like genetic deterministic. I'm a boy and I have these chromosomes they classify me as a male, but I am so I'm so female in my brain that like no matter like despite all the programming, like I have to wear dresses and I have to play with dolls, right? I don't know. Is this consistent with like all the waves of feminism? If it's really sort of like this kind of sort of blank slateism that I see as sort of the heart of a lot of feminism. I mean, is this really like consistent with the trans stuff? Because the trans stuff seems to be like a sort of like the scientific sort of assertions. Um, and like some of them have like some of them do have the some of the things that you're required to say do have sort of the flavor of like religious incantation. Like you have to say someone's a woman, they identify as a woman. Okay, you have to define woman in their way. But what they actually are saying is going on is there is a thing called a male brain and there is a thing called a female brain, and like the outer is one thing and like the inner is another thing, and you're just sort of born that way and you have to accept it right now or I'm gonna commit suicide and you're gonna have all the blood of all these kids on earth. It seems like they're saying no, there is no choice. It's just as it seems like it's just as like tangible and real as like nationhood or race or sex or anything else. It's like they want to act like it's a real but there's a biological basis to all of this. And I don't know, it seems really sort of in tension with a lot of other things that liberals supposedly believe.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, yes. To some extent, no. Specifically on the scientific part of this, it seems like first of all, this is not backed up by science. They say it is because they say, oh,
Oh, I,
the
I wasn't
scans
under
are.
the impression that it was.
No. I know you haven't, but specifically this point about having female brains and male bodies, it turns out like yes, if you compare, for example, male to female transsexuals to straight men, then they do have more feminine sort of. Well, all of these scans about the PET scans and what areas of the brain light up are kind of a bit of a mixed bag anyway. But even if we imagine that these studies are very serious, what hasn't been done is comparing them to homosexuals. And it turns out, actually, to the extent that those comparisons have been done, their brain patterns tend to run more towards the homosexual, except for some of the AGP types who are like actually like straight men from New Jersey, to quote Sex and the City, who have a specific sexual fetish about this. But it seems like what's happening is sort of a resurgence of the idea of the soul, right? Where we give the mind there's something like sort of ineffable and separated about quote unquote who we are, that can't really be questioned, that can't really be defined. We simply know that there's this sense of ourselves, and it almost seems like it comes along with all of the same mind body problems or soul body problems that were the stuff of philosophy in the Middle Ages. So that's kind of interesting. And then specifically to defend my point, which I believe I'm maybe not alone in making, but I haven't seen a lot of other people argue it this way, because most conservatives seem to think that it's a straight line from gay marriage to the trans stuff. And I actually think they're connected in a certain way, that if you imagine marriage to be the union of partners based on love, that it makes sense to then include homosexual unions in that. And inherent in there is the idea that complementarity is not an essential part of marriage, or procreation is not an essential part of marriage, right? So to that extent, they are sort of connected, but I really see whether we tolerate or celebrate homosexuality as sort of an offshoot. To me, the reason that I think that the TERFs have an internal contradiction they can never resolve is because they claimed that the differences between men and women were largely, in very important ways, socially constructed. And they've always claimed that there's not a strong biological basis for why men are one way and women are another way. And it seems like a very unprincipled exception to me, because the biological differences above the neck, in the brain, in psychological traits, and all of this stuff, right? In evolutionary biology, all of those differences between the sexes are just as biological as whether someone has a penis or a vagina. It's more obvious in the latter case, right? Our brains are inside our heads, right? Like, it's not as obvious as secondary sex characteristics, but they're just as biological. Like the neurological differences between men and women are just as biological as the sex characteristics outside their bodies. It's not any less concrete or real or physical. But they've always denied the first part of it, and now that the train has finally got off on the station, what even our bodies, especially in a sort of digital age, our bodies can be rearranged to match whatever or how we feel inside our brains. I think it's very uncomfortable for feminists to talk about, for example, oh hey, these sex differences, these biological sex differences, they might be real, and they might have implications about how men and women live their lives, or how society should encourage them to live their lives. They might have implications about what makes a good man versus a good woman. Those things might not be identical, right? And I think there is a tension. I don't see any principled reason to say, well, male and female brains are just interchangeable. There's no neurological differences, to deny the biology on that front. But then, okay, well then, if it doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman with regard to family choices, career choices, these are all things that are way more important than how fast you swim the 200-meter butterfly, by the way, right? Like, in anybody's life, you've been saying sex is unimportant for more than 150 years. Sex is unimportant to the most, basic functions of society. Well, to now turn around and say, well, but actually in this very limited number of cases,
Now
it
you
was
want to
very
win
important.
swimming. Yeah, now we're not so equal anymore. Yeah.
It does seem like it's contradictory to me, and
Yeah.
I think that I just think they're wrong about that. I think if they go back and they read Simone de Beauvoir, they'll find everything they need for the trans ideology.
I love it. I love the attacking the TERFs from the right. That's why there's that we don't have time for this now. But I was supposed to say, I sort of think Dylan Mulvaney is maybe, I don't want to say conservative icon, but actually, like, there's something about Dylan Mulvaney that's sort of interesting that we can go into. But we'll have to save it for some other time. All right, and it's been great talking to you.
Yeah, it's always great talking to you, Richard.